When I was, I think in the fourth grade, we had a textbook, and that year our history lessons weren't so much focused on dates and events that took place, but on great Americans. And when you open that textbook up, these were all short, what you call profiles of who these great Americans were. When you open that textbook up, the first picture you saw was of a handsome blonde haired man standing in a uniform that looked like it was made out of tinfoil. And he was holding a helmet in one arm, tucked under his arm against his ribs. And that was, at the time, a man known as John Glenn, who was the first American to orbit the Earth and then later was elected to the U.S. Senate, serving many terms there. And then I can remember in 1998, when the shuttle went up and it took him up back into space, and he was nearly 77 years old at the time. And in one of the probably most watched shuttle missions ever. In fact, I remember working in a television newsroom, and everybody in the building came back and sat there and watched it on the monitors, the launch, just because, well, it was John Glenn. And in my generation, he was perhaps bigger than any other hero in America at the time, bigger than any sports hero. And he just exuded what you'd call that small town, almost Jimmy Stewart style personality of that aw shucks behavior. It's coming up at 8:44, 31 right now. We have a guest joining us who actually got to know the great man in person. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil joins us periodically on the program. The colonel is retired from the United States Air Force and had a lengthy career himself in a lot of what you might call challenging, and I don't mean that as any insult or pun, challenging roles, including when he was the administrator of the Shuttle Challenger Commission, and he also got to work with another one of his fellow Ohioans, Neil Armstrong, who was helping chair that investigatory body. But first of all, Colonel, we want to say welcome back to our program and thank you.
It's always my pleasure.
Off the start, we wanted to point out you'd probably been in the Air Force close to 20 years yourself when the Pentagon decided that you were going to be the guy who was the liaison to the House and Senate, and at that point you got to know Senator Glenn quite well, as I understand.
Yeah, he was one of the offices that I was responsible for, and so I did spend a lot of time working with his staff, certainly his home office in Ohio, and then John Glenn himself on several occasions had an opportunity to brief him brief him briefly on several issues, particularly involving his constituents. So.
I just was watching, and it was repeated multiple times last night on Fox News Channel, where they had the soundbite from Jack Germond, who's the former Baltimore newspaper columnist who got to know Glenn very, very well. And Germond comments were that when Glenn first ran for the U.S. Senate, he said he wasn't much of a politician, but he was a really nice guy. And I get the impression that over the years, he never really, he didn't absorb that politician role, at least in all the negative aspects we know of it, and that he remained pretty much true to his small town roots.
Well, that's the case, and it had something to do with him, just like with Neil Armstrong later. Of course, the Mercury astronauts went through a battery of all kind of physical as well as mental tests and evaluations, and it was determined. They determined that he was of the original seven was the most suited for relations with the public, as they said, and knowing that he was going to be certainly a historical figure and the face of NASA for a long time. That's why he was chosen to be the first American in space.
Ron Shaw, who was a longtime Ohio State Buckeyes broadcaster, ended up then being one of my college professors. And I remember him telling me he knew Glenn very, very well. And when we had some issues in the 80s, when Glenn got caught up in that snare and the savings and loan crisis, said that he felt that it wasn't anything that, because people said it tarnished Glenn as a hero, but Dr. Shaw told me, he said, no, He said John was just so squeaky clean honest, he couldn't imagine that anybody he was dealing with would be involved in something like that. What's your take on that?
Well, I really do think that's the case. It's we're very cynical now of our politicians, given where uh, where we are today in regard to how we feel about them. But John Glenn was he was an exceptional person. He uh, and I can believe that he felt that way, um, and without any reservation. Um, so my take is that he sort of got caught up in this scandal, if you will, at the time, and I know he personally regretted it.
Our guest is Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil, and Steve is retired from the United States Air Force and got to know John Glenn personally when Glenn was serving in the U.S. Senate. But you also being from Ohio, the home of flight and space exploration, if you really look at it that way, you got a chance, I guess, to have an encounter with Glenn when you were still in what, high school?
Well, yeah, I was a senior in high school on February 20th, 1962. We went into space. Um, and then it just really sparked what has become now a lifelong fascination and interest in the space program. But John Glenn, they had a nationally televised. They televised nationally his homecoming to his little hometown in New Concord, Ohio. And my dad at the time worked for Gulf Oil Corporation, and they wanted a Gulf representative to be there for the telecast or the broadcast, and so he was the closest, and so he got access to tickets, and I got to go, and I got to meet John Glenn and some of the other astronauts that were there, and then got to go attend the news conference that followed, and so it was a very heady experience for a high school senior, given the circumstances. So that was really my first encounter with Senator Glenn, not knowing sometime in the future I'd be working with him at that time. Um, I did share something else in common with him when my first assignment in the Air Force was Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, and of course that's where the astronauts did a lot of their training, the Mercury astronauts initially, and so John Glenn and I found out from my barber in Hampton, Virginia, that he and I had shared the same barber in Hampton, Virginia.
Well, these seven men, and I'm old enough, just old enough to really remember um, how big they were in the 1960s, and I'm old enough, just old enough to remember the fire that killed one of the other original seven, and that was Gus Grissom, and of course Ed White and Roger Chaffee all died in that accident on the launch pad, but
Right.
David Schumacher, who both you and I are acquainted with, David had flown with Strategic Air Command, and as it turned out, he was a close friend with Gus Grissom at the time. And one of the saddest stories that I ever heard, David told me that he had done a story about how the astronauts thought that capsule was unsafe. David came back to CBS to put the story on the air, and Walter Cronkite said, "Well, David, nobody wants to rain on NASA's parade." So he spiked the story, and then after it was done, that the accident happened. David was so incensed by Walter's move that he quit CBS and ended up eventually going over to ABC and working there instead. But uh, he shared that story with me one day, and he talked about how Cronkite then didn't even cover the funeral. He was too embarrassed, so David covered the funeral. And I remember him telling me it was one of the most widely watched events probably in American television history at the time because of the who Gus Grissom and these men happened to be, because they were larger, so much larger than life at the time. Is that a good way to put that?
Well, they were. I mean, they became modern day. Well, the right stuff, obviously, and they were true heroes, and they came along at a time, particularly in our history, because the Russians were beating us at the space program at that time, and so America was sort of depressed about the fact that we were not doing so well, and so once this Glenn in particular came along, and it sort of wiped out all of that that uh, that negative aspects of where we were, and really launched us then into the space age, and particularly with President Kennedy, because the Kennedys became very, very close friends of John Glenn, and both politically, but real friends. And it was actually Bobby Kennedy that encouraged and basically was the person who propelled Glenn into politics, and convinced him that that's where he should go, and obviously he did. So that, but he was bigger in life. He really had that personality. He never changed, and America was certainly blessed to have had him. A lot like Neil Armstrong, Glenn never really capitalized on his fame. Of course, he was sought after for so many things and so many honors, but he kept a perspective on what it was he had accomplished.
8:54, and we've got a couple of minutes left speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil, retired from the U.S. Air Force, of course, who got to know both John Glenn and Neil Armstrong during his time of service to the country, and 32 right now. Wrapping up, I meet so many people in political life today, and all they demand is loyalty, loyalty, loyalty. In other words, they want sycophants, and they're surrounded they're like courtiers, in some medieval court. But you got to work with people like Glenn and also Bob Dole and some of these others who had experiences in life, either war experience, both having war experience, and gone through that forge first. They weren't like that back in that era, were they?
No, no, they weren't at all. Uh, but everything is overflowed now, and as we see, and it would have been interesting to if you could have shifted this forward with the that particular era, and the astronauts and all, how they would be, how we would see them today. I think they would be. I don't think John Glenn would have actually wanted to be a part of this in regard to being challenged as by the media.
And again, he was a Democrat, but he was of a different style. I mean, today when we see all of these people who are screaming and yelling at loggerheads, he had a much more courtly approach, I guess, to how he did politics.
Well, that's for sure.
I think we've lost the colonel's call. Well, tell you what we'll do. we'll wish him a happy holiday when we get a chance. Maybe in the next couple of weeks, maybe we can chat with him one more time, find another issue or the like. But do want to thank him for taking some time out with us this morning. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I've got 32. We bounced up to 33 for a moment. It will get a bit warmer before the day is over, and it might melt some of that ice that we have on the roads this morning. I do want to quickly mention, speaking of the weather, and it'll warm up a little bit for the next 3 or 4 days. It will clear the snow out, but by the middle of next week, we have daytime highs only in the mid-20s, and then we'll get another round of snow showers and snowstorms passing through the area. And if you haven't already noticed it, this is a challenging time for your heating unit. And if you're having problems and it's not running as efficiently as it should, you need to call the pros at Ramsey Heating and Electric in Burley. Now, they'll come out, they'll get the job done right, and they'll get it done right the first time. Problem-free, cozy winters are found at Ramsey Heating and Electric, 2600 Overland Avenue in Burley. You can give them a telephone call. The telephone number is 678-0459. That's 678-0459. Ramsey Heating and Electric, where they sell warm winters and cool summers. Got a short break coming up. We're going to be talking about firearms in the next hour of the program, as we do on Friday mornings, expecting Todd Eccles from Patriot Defense, as well as, of course, Forrest Anderson has been the prodigal host wandering around the country over the last few weeks, and we've had John Statler coming in and filling in as well. But we might see Forrest again today from Washington Street Pond. We're going to be talking a little bit, too, during the course of the hour about this proposal for nationwide reciprocity when it comes to concealed carry. As I said earlier, we don't know that the Californians will go along with it. They don't seem to want to go along with anything any longer, but then who wants to go there? Bill Colley with you on Top Story. One more hour ahead, but first we'll check in with Fox News at 9 o'clock. You're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com.